As you probably know, a key aspect to our pipeline safety oversight involves our state partners. And so represented here today, we have NAPSR, or members of the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives, too, who will give their perspective on the issue. But I'm going to turn it over to Steve Nanny to be our moderator for this event, or for this panel. So, Steve, and Steve will carry us to lunch.
The thing I realized after giving my speech, I guess they turned the air down because I'm about to freeze in here. Or my blood's real thin. I don't know which one. The next session that we've got will be letting the states go through and give their perspective on any changes to class location. And the first speaker we've got will be Steve Pott. He's chief of the gas pipeline safety for the Colorado Public Utilities. And he came today, so I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you. Good morning. First, I would like to say thank you, Steve, for your presentation. And I hear rumors that we might be taking a field trip this afternoon since we have sunshine today. Probably so. Sure. As Steve mentioned, I'm Steve Pott with the Colorado Pipeline Safety Program. Natural gas, we do intrastate only. So the perspectives today in my presentation is going to touch on a lot of different aspects with the state's interests and concerns. And joining me today is going to be Don Stursma, which will be following up for my presentation. For those of you that don't know who or what NAPSR is, we're the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives from state pipeline personnel. And we strive to strengthen the state pipeline safety programs through the promotion of safety discussions as we're entertaining here today. And we've got oversight responsibility for the safe and reliable transportation of natural gas and hazardous liquids pipelines through the U.S. And the primary focus of the state pipeline programs have been on the intrastate natural gas side, even though some of our members have both. Wanted to start with just a general NAPSR perspective, is that it's of probably 20 to 25 of our membership have gathering systems within their states. So on the gathering topic, we don't have a collective focus or priority on that topic because of where the production is in the United States, and resulting in the diverse membership, diverse concerns that we've got. Integrity management, again, must adequately address the potential and interactive threats through data elements, continuing reassessment, prioritizing life before property. Although the diverse ideas that we have is that safety is still our primary objective. And balancing the functional relationship approaches, again, that we've got low and high pressure gathering systems of oil and gas leading into supplying the transmission and to the low pressure distribution system. So even though today the objective is to focus on transmission only, we did step outside of the bounds a little bit because of the interaction between the different functions within the industries. With following up on some of the comments made, that when August 2011 is when the advance notice of proposed rulemaking started. January of 2012, the Reauthorization Act. August 2013, notice of inquiry. April 2014, class location workshop today. You can see that a lot of these rulemakings are extending over a long period of time. And that makes it difficult not only for the industry and for PHMSA, but also for the states. Our day jobs is on the regulatory enforcement of pipeline safety. And so for workshops like this, we do have a lot of interest, but our day jobs take us in different directions that we're not always able to participate timely on specific topics. And we just do the best we can. That we're hopeful that these workshops and studies will provide information for an effective rulemaking process before the next reauthorization and related issues are not dropped between the workshops. And that's one of my concerns that I wanted us to stress, is that we might have brought up issues or discussion 3 years ago, not bringing them up today, just because of, not because they're no longer an important concern of ours, but it's just over the time process of these workshops, we sometimes lose focus. And also that we wanted to make sure that because of these rulemaking processes of being so slow, that alert bulletins and frequently asked questions will not or cannot be a solution for quick fixes to pipeline safety codification of what we're talking about today. And if an expansion of the gas integrity management program occurs, how are we going to bring into the lessons learned from approaches to the integrity management, what we've learned in Part 195 on the liquid side versus talking today about Part 192? Are there some solutions that, due to changes of technology, that part of the code has already addressed or will address, that we can bring over to the natural gas side of the program? And other initiatives, a lot of you here in the industry today have already been actively involved in the API RP80 1173 process, and I didn't want I wanted to bring that up just for those that haven't seen that process. It's going on, and within that RP, that there's references to the holistic approach and functional relationship between the parts and the whole, and it's emphasized that current code fixes may be fragmented patches to the much larger safety picture. And the holistic approach takes into account the NAPSR integrity management concerns. And the class location methodology, historic approach to the design, operations, and maintenance activities are based on the class location concept, as Steve had mentioned. And the public safety is the reason to expand the integrity management program into the rural areas. This will affect the nation's rural midstream industry segment safety policy, currently not regulated pipelines. So the question that we want to propose to the industry as well as to PHMSA, how can states ignore joint transmission and gathering easements in Class 1 rural locations? We can't write rules about one portion of the industry and ignore the other when they're only, in some cases, 15 feet apart. And we might have an 8-inch transmission line at low pressure, and within 15 feet, we have a 30-inch gathering pipeline that's not regulated. There's no common sense. We just want to make sure that these issues aren't ignored as we proceed in the discussion with integrity management. And also, PHMSA does not provide financial safety program support to state safety inspections of rural midstream industry. I wanted to stress that because we receive a lot of questions from the public that why aren't the states taking initiatives on their own? And one reason is if we do that, we could have the potential of 20 to 25 different approaches to midstream industry, as well as the financial part of our programs aren't supported by the safety. You know, there's only so much money to go around within this process, just as you within the industry have And so we're focused also. We put our priorities where they need to be, and that's where the public is. Some considerations of the risk to the public and material science in consequence areas. Clear testing options for unknown piping material specifications. If joint upstream and downstream operations exist, will lowering weighted risks in rural areas be mandated? Can financial considerations versus a direct risk focus to the public safety in populated areas? So this point here is a little bit confusing. What do I mean by mandating a lower weighted risk in the rural areas? That with the risk approach, that if you don't lower your risk in weighting factors in rural areas, you could transfer your focus and the financial resources that you have into rural areas. Is that the primary objective of improving or changing risk management as we proceed? That I would propose that would be a mistake. That public safety still has to be the primary priority, and then the question, must an operator address existing priorities of covered segments established by their baseline assessment plans under 192.911 before focusing on rural threats? If we change the pipeline safety code approach here in the next year, what do we do and how do we address the existing threats that the industry has been trying to address for the last 5 years plus? That all of a sudden they shift their priorities and interests to the rural areas, and not forgetting, but being shifted away from the populated areas. If gas quality is not met due to system upsets at rural input metering points, should an additional safety buffer be necessary if an automatic shut-in valve not used? This is one of the things that came up, that once we shift away from the non-rural areas of Class 3, Class 4 locations, if that's your priority, this is one consideration that you probably have never had. If you're not taking gas from a production midstream portion of the industry, that this is one area that should be looked at closer once we expand to rural areas. And the threat of, you'll have a mixing of gases, but for those few miles after the take points, that could have an effect on internal corrosion type issues. And the numerous references to class location in the there's no need to go further into that Steve Nanny's presentation hit that quite well. And then is a potential solution to better define rural versus non-rural and include moderate consequence areas. Part 195 has a definition of rural. Part 192 dropped that definition and is focused on class location definitions. That once we start bringing that, should we bring the definition of rural back into the Part 192 side? So again, there's lessons learned from both sides of the code, and we shouldn't forget that they exist, that there might be solutions on that side of the code also. And then lessons learned, mentioned that. Defining rural versus non-rural in Part 192 would allow operators to continue to operate under class location concept. Potential impact radius equation must address the raw gas and the dual phase flow. A lot of the discussion's been, is it rich gas or regular pipeline quality gas? Dual phase flow is very rarely addressed and brought up within the code at all. It's either one or the other, but it's not both. And that's one thing that in the real world that we get to deal with, especially on the state level on smaller systems. And the PIR equation forces operators to know their systems. So I wanted to point that out, that the class location approach, even though you've got a larger buffer zone, the PIR actually makes the operator ask the question, what do I have in the ground? Is it steel? Is it non-steel? Is it different new technology of steel? The new composite type piping out there, it has a different failure mode than the traditional steel piping that we've got. So those are the type of things that if we're going to be using new technology and approaches moving into the future, we've got to take into account what new type of pipe material is out there and will eventually be introduced into the regulated portion of the pipeline safety world. PHMSA's rulemaking should be prompt to minimize industry, regulatory confusion, and allow focused training not only for the industry but for the pipeline safety state and federal regulators, that once code changes, we also have to be retrained for all those changes and considerations, as well as the industry itself. In my closing comments, so I threw a lot here up on this page for considerations that can the current transmission valving spacing requirements, specifically 192, 179, assist in the class location methodology, discussion expand to line sections. We do a lot of referring and discussion on line segments, but we don't really talk about line sections. And by considering defining a non-rural transmission high consequence area line section between block valves 4 miles upstream and 4 miles downstream of an area defined in 192.5, or what we're used to, the Class 3, Class 4 designated areas, that maybe that would simplify not only for the industry, but make a lot more consistent approach for first responders in their understanding of why segments are addressed, but the 100 yards, 300 yards, or whatever distance it is in between high consequence areas isn't, being addressed. So I think for that conceptually, that would help the public also understand that once you enter into a Class 3 area, the approach and application of integrity management is going to be through a point A to point B complete approach versus short segments. And additional buffer zones, rural transmission and gathering impact zone is equal to the PIR for rich gas, which was mentioned previously of 0.73. That would at least add an additional buffer zone without asking the question, Jesus, should it be 250 yards, 260 yards, 220 yards? Those type of discussions that do come up for the small diameter pipelines that do exist. Once you get certain parts of the country, we just have a lot of smaller diameter pipe. And within the states, the intrastate natural gas systems, if we're looking at a predominant less than or equal to 20-inch pipeline systems out there, you could see from the graph that I believe Steve Nanny had put up there, our concerns and interests aren't going to be the same as a 40-inch pipeline, the threats for the 40-inch pipeline. We understand what they are. It's just that we don't know what that animal is because we don't have them in our states. It's not; those are generally going to be the interstate pipeline systems. So we support PHMSA in that discussion and understand it, but if we're quiet on the issue, it's just that we don't have that type diameter threat within our states. And the integrity management process must be risk-based with risk factors weighted to protect the public, so pipeline operator safety priorities are not diluted. And my comment about dilution again is the priority going to remain in a Class 3, Class 4 populated area, or will it shift to the rural areas of a Class 1 type situation? And complete existing baseline assessments must add, before adding different focus to integrity management program, I think will have to formally be addressed, is that once we change the existing baseline assessments, what does that mean to state and federal programs and our response to the general public as far as having to explain why a shift of priority has occurred because of a code change. It just doesn't make sense to the public when we start shifting our priorities away from where they live. And a new approach to integrity management must have an achievable and realistic timeline, that we always want to do something really quickly, but let's not make it overly complicated and extend this over many years when we may not have to make it that complicated. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Don Stursma, and probably Don and I can answer questions after both of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Just one thing I'd like to do before Don gets up here is just to highlight a couple of things. And as you know, the reason the states are represented is the state programs. What we do on the federal level affects the state programs on the intrastate and the smaller lines more so than we all realize sometimes. Just like what Steve said. The other thing, as far as definitions, I know when we were going through our considerations earlier, when I gave the presentation I did, some of the things we didn't point out is whether it's class location is the moderate consequence area that Steve talked about, or the MCA, which would be down to one dwelling within that pipeline. That is something that we could consider going forward. I think it's a good idea, and also the rural versus non-rural situation that he talked about. And then lastly is the gas quality. To me, is if you've got a pipeline that's getting a lot of fallout on liquids, or it may not be treated quite well, and you have water in it. I know in my background I've seen that a lot, and you're having to deal with internal corrosion. Is one consideration on what we go forward. It's got to be ILI piggable. Is that something we should consider if the dew points are at a certain point? Is that something we should require going forward? So the dual phase flow lines on the smaller is an issue that the states deal with. PHMSA may not deal with it quite as much, but I know they have to. So anyway, Steve, thank you for your presentation. It hit some very good points. Now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Don with the Iowa Utilities Board to give his viewpoints on the state side. So let me find his presentation, and we'll go forward. Can you help me there, camera? Where is it? Go up and you can go right down
Down up there? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Morning. Morning. Good. Somebody's awake. My name is Don Stursma. I'm manager of the Safety and Engineering section of the Iowa Utilities Board. I've been doing this for 33 years now, and when I started, I had no gray hair. That tells you something about this business, I guess. Now, since a number of tragic accidents, with San Bruno being the poster child for it, PHMSA's been looking for various ways to improve pipeline safety, especially of transmission lines. And there's a lot of moving parts going on right now, some of which kind of overlap, and it's kind of hard to have a discussion on one without pieces of the other sneaking in. I'm going to try and focus pretty much entirely on class location. Part of what we're looking at is whether integrity management type principles should be expanded to more pipe than the rules currently cover. And I think the question we have is what criteria we should use to help decide whether to apply additional standards. And class locations is, of course, one method we're using. And before I get into this, I'm going to remind people that despite some opinions of the contrary, transmission lines can be less than 20%. Whether those should be treated different regulations, in the regulations, I think is a subject for another forum. And there are also plastic transmission lines out there. So when you hear me talk about some smaller transmission lines, and you said, they're under 20%, no need to worry about those. Yes, they are included in the regulations. But what does class location do? It's a measurement of consequence. We define risk as probability times consequence. Part 192 has two ways to categorize consequence right now, either class location or something that's in a high consequence area. Now there's been some talk that the integrity management principle should be applied to all transmission lines. I think that's a little bit of overkill. It would be extremely expensive, and there's a statement that says, if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So I think we need to keep a system for identifying which areas have the highest consequence, and that's where we at least first apply our efforts. And pipeline safety regulations and integrity management and everything is designed to reduce the probability of an incident. I might mention later a few ways to deal with consequence, which is an equally valid way to reduce risk, but that's another subject. Now, eliminating class location would require what? Major rewrite of Part 192, or what I would call it the Full Employment and Job Creation Act for people who work on federal pipeline safety regulations. That would be a huge project. You know, class location also applies to distribution systems, so you have to figure out a way to keep a consequence system for distribution while separating out transmission. I think that would be quite a task. Right now there's at least a certain amount of overlap in the rules between transmission and distribution in some respects. A lot of pieces to figure out on that. It requires a major rewrite of operator, operating, and maintenance plan, and perhaps some other procedures. So it's an equally large project for operators. Revision of state laws and regulations that include class location as a criteria. My state legislature just got done adopting a law that directly cites a federal pipeline safety regulation. So if something would ever change in that regulation that affects the intent of the law, we'd have to go back in and change the law, which those of you who worked with legislatures probably know that's not easy, fun, and Lord only knows what else happens when you open anything up. And, of course, revision of industry standards that include class location. Is the B318 code going to rewrite itself to conform to something other than class location for a lot of its stuff? It invented it. I don't know. There's a lot of work. See, I'm kind of I wouldn't say I'm a lazy person, but I do like to, before I put a lot of time and effort into something, I might just look to see if there's a better way. And to tell you the truth, part of what I'm talking about today is going to be, can we find a way to work within the framework of what we already have rather than inventing something totally different and very disruptive. So which method measures risk? I should have actually said which method measures consequence more precisely. You have class location 1, 2, 3, 4, the four-tier approach to the level of consequence from a failure. You have the high consequence area method, which identifies areas of high consequence, and then there's everything else, which it really doesn't care about under the rules. There's been proposals under integrity verification to introduce a concept of moderate consequence area, and that still leaves a low consequence or everything else area. So we've kind of got two systems right now for identifying consequence. I just thought I'd throw in a note on there's been at least one proposal adopted class location 5, and also another one for adding 6 and 7. I'm not quite sure what would go into that. It would require the same kind of rewrites, although less extent than what I mentioned before about writing Part 192. But one thing that occurs to me is the write-up, which is a summary of the class location 5 concept that I saw, would have a lower SMICE limit. And if I'm running a pipeline into a dense urban area, all of a sudden I have to lower my pressure to reduce the stress in the steel and reduce my capacity. What is the impact of that going to be? If you want to have to build another pipeline in one of these dense urban areas, good luck. As a regulator, I'll look over your shoulder, but I'll make sure you take all the blame. Just thought I'd throw that in there because one thing Part 192 and all these proposals do not do is consider the service aspect of what we do in the safety regulations. Okay, one thing about class location. It applies to both transmission and distribution. It's based on facility and structures within a fixed distance, 660 feet, or certain uses within 300 feet. It's independent of pipeline size or pressure. It just establishes a zone, and you look what's in that zone. Now, it may impose stricter standards on line, even if the structures or facilities that give it its class location are out of the inside potential impact radius. In my state, we don't have a lot of huge high-pressure pipelines. We have, 4-inch 400 pounds, 6-inch 600 pounds, things of that nature that feed our communities and businesses. Their potential impact radius, well, it's a 4-inch 400 pound, 55 feet, 6-inch 600 pound, 100 feet, 8-inch 800 pound, 150 feet. I've just encompassed probably over 90% of the intrastate pipelines in Iowa by saying that. And if I've got a 100-foot potential impact radius, and I've got a housing development that's 500 feet away, it's a Class 3 area. I'm applying Class 3 criteria, but what am I really accomplishing? I'm doing nothing to reduce risk because I'm doing nothing to reduce consequence. There's also the alternative. There are certain very large pipelines that could have a potential impact radius that could be greater than 660 feet. The class location method does not recognize the possibility that such pipelines could exist. Like we heard earlier, pipelines keep getting bigger and badder, and some of the larger ones may have really exceeded the parameters that people had in mind when the rules were written. Of course, then you have the high consequence concept, which estimates the area within which injury or property damage is probable if the line ruptures. It applies to transmission only. It is based on pipe diameter and pressure, and it can change if the pipe diameter, I should say, or pressure changes. And you can even eliminate high consequence areas. I say if a line can be redefined as distribution or the measures taken. When these rules were new, I went to my operators list of 5 ways they could get rid of a high consequence area, which is not a way of getting around the rule. It's a way of reducing risk by alternate means. Instead of reducing probability of failure, I'm reducing the consequence. And I can see you're curious what those are. One is lower the pressure, pretty obvious. Move the town border station upstream. So again, another way of converting from transmission to distribution. Look at the definition. If it was a pipeline that went into town, and now the town's grown up around it, you put a bunch of taps on it. Sometimes you can make a logical argument that this line no longer serves the transmission function. It's now distribution, and changes classification that way. Another way is to move the pipeline, which seems like a lot of work. But if you've got, say, a single site that's creating a high consequence area, and you look at the expense of complying with the integrity management regulations on that piece of pipe, it might be cheaper to put a bend in the pipe to increase its distance from the object. And the 5th method is basically what I would call buy out the HCA. If the county puts a picnic shelter up right next to your pipeline and got enough use to create an HCA, offer to build them a better shelter further back. If you pay attention to the local news and find out they're planning on putting in a softball complex next to your pipeline, go to the city and probably offer to help fund a layout or a site that doesn't affect your high consequence area. Again, it's your decision. It's based on which is going to cause you the least grief. Now, it's been suggested that integrity management standards be applied to all pipelines in Class 3 and 4. Again, the structures that determine the class location may be outside the potential impact radius. So class location alone may not be an effective method of allocating integrity management resources. If my intent is to reduce risk, I've reduced the probability of a pipeline failure. But if I do nothing to change consequence, because the consequences are pretty low to begin with, because everything that might be affected is well outside the potential impact radius, am I making effective use of my resources? Now, Okay, now if we're going to pursue expanding where we apply integrity management principles, and class location is an issue, there's at least one option to look at, and this is not an original with me. I stole it straight out of the integrity management regulations. You can continue to go with the traditional method of 660 feet. If I am in a dense residential area and I no matter what I do, it's going to be a Class 3 location, I can just stick with the traditional. It's been a Class 3, we're going to leave it a Class 3. Or, rather than adopt a whole new set of procedures and tests based on integrity management principles, I can maybe take a look at the potential impact radius. Maybe you have two ways of determining class location. If I go 600 feet as a Class 3, or I can look at the number of structures within the potential impact radius. Two ways of defining the class location. And there's already been some options thrown out on how to do that. It might be a different house count than used for traditional class location, but it's an option. And that was also one way of dealing with one of the, what I see as one of the perpetual thorns in the side of industry, the county church rule, where somebody plunks something down close to your pipeline, changes the class location, and you have to deal with it. This would give you the option of taking a look, well, how far away is it? Is it a consequence if I have a rupture? If not, an optional way of looking at it that way. But that's one thing I see as a proposed way to do it. Give you an optional way of determining class location. It's maybe a little bit more refined, so you don't end up, again, misapplying resources where they really don't accomplish much. Now, one thing that neither class location nor high consequence area does, it's considered, I've termed here, secondary effects. And that's possible, or the boundary of the potential impacts. You can have grass or forest fires that spread to other areas. You can have embers lighting more distant structures. You can have disruption of vehicular traffic. That's come out in the West Virginia accident, and it's even if the road is not directly affected, you can have traffic diverted and make a real mess. One thing, again, the method does not address is the consequences of service loss, which I would like to see being a factor in deciding which pipelines get some sort of extra special treatment, but it's not something that's currently addressed in the rules. I just throw that in there to show that consequences can extend well outside the potential impact radius and maybe even 660 feet. Oh, in this case, the consequences really don't amount to anything, but it's an example, it's just some field stubble burning, but it's an example of how the impact can spread. And this is, of course, San Bruno, the circle representing the potential impact radius. You can see the extent of the damage extended well outside the potential impact radius. So impact radius does not necessarily define the consequences. I use the term buffer, but that's probably not the best word. One thing the class location does do, it gives additional protection from what I will call spread. My previous example, if I've got a 100-foot potential impact radius, my Class 3 development is 500 feet away, it's probably safe from the direct effects of a pipeline rupture. But if it starts a forest fire, my 500 feet all of a sudden might not give me very much protection. I mean, should we, if I had good ideas for how to develop this criteria, I would propose them, but I just mainly throw it out as food for thought. But maybe sometime we also need to consider secondary impacts from a pipeline failure that really aren't being addressed in any of our current systems. And that's it. That's usually my audience looks like when I get done.
Thank you, Don. if you don't mind, I'd like to put a few more words into what you said. You tell me if you agree with what I'm saying. Here's my takeaway from what Don said. Keep it simple. Whatever we do, whatever we consider, keep it simple. Also, is if we're looking at a PIR or a class location, consider a buffer zone. And then limit the impact to the present code. Don't rewrite the code. Don't keep Don busy for the rest of his career rewriting the Iowa State Code. So I think that's my takeaways from what you said.
It might end my career. I would say that buffer zone probably is not the best term, although it's the one I used. It's mainly a recognition that whatever system we use for identifying limits, damages can extend outside those limits, and at least be something that's considered.
Also, on a different note, you see the picture he's got there. I can see he took the cherry blossom walk that I took. He took a picture on the way. Anyway, I'd like to open it up for any questions here from the audience and our listeners also. So with that, if you have any questions, I know Jim Merritt's over here on the left-hand side of the room. Cameron's on the other. Are there any questions for Steve or Don?
Hi, Dave Adler, Columbia Pipeline Group. Steve, my first question is for you. Not being particularly familiar with Part 195 regulations, could you explain a little bit more what you mean about incorporating the rural concept into Part 192 regulations?
I think to put it simply, in Part 195, they define rural, and it's basically outside of city limits. So we dropped within the gathering pipeline safety portion of the code on the gas side in 192. We had initially had a definition in there for that the gathering systems were regulated within city limits. And the approach was at that time, just because they're within inside city limits doesn't make it a populated area. And so it was felt that it was possibly over-regulated. So we backed off and said our focus is going to be in areas of population, pushing us back to using the class location as the defining areas. And in Part 195, they don't use that approach. They just said within city limits, this is what you're going to do, and that's a non-rural area. So that would be one consideration, that if we move away from class location definitions within the code, or the concept is, that would be a fallback. And so we would be getting into within the city limits, and then you've got to take into consideration too that if you're not incorporated city, you've got a clustered building type situation, how you're going to address that. So just by me mentioning non-rural versus rural, they still need to be redefined and looked at again.
Any more questions? If not, I've got a webcast question, and this is for you, Don. How does your presentation address gathering lines? And then there's a second part after you answer that.
I deliberately didn't go with gathering lines because Iowa has no gathering lines. So I really haven't looked into the issues surrounding what do you do with gathering lines if we change all this. I think Steve covered that part.
Okay. Well, you answered the second part too, so.
Good job.
Okay. Any more questions? Both Don and Steve traveled a long way to come here today to present. I know lunch is close by, so any more before we go? Well, we'll be, first, before we do go, I'd like to thank both Don and Steve. Would we give them a hand for their efforts today? Thank you. Also, we'll be breaking for lunch now until 1:30 p.m. It's now on my watch. I guess it's around 11:30. So we'll break for 2 hours, and we'll be back at 1:30. Huh? 1 o'clock? Okay. Since we got through 30 minutes early, come back at 1 o'clock instead of 1:30. I know the program we gave out for the meeting says 1:30. Plan to come back at 1 o'clock. And if you're on the webcast, please remember 1 o'clock instead of 1:30 to be back on. Thank you.